Good morning. Nice to see you all here on what has turned out to be a rainy morning. Kind of a surprise after yesterday. I was doing some work with a theater company, and their rehearsal space is in a warehouse, and all the walls are windows, and it's a southern exposure. So, and the air conditioning are two old floor fans blowing hot air around. So this is actually kind of a relief. Anyhow, I just want to welcome you all here. I'm going to be giving a talk today titled Sandcastles. And the title actually comes from a story or a parable from the Pali Canon, parable of the sandcastles. So I'll just start out telling you that story. And then I think it's kind of an interesting story. So there were some children playing beside a river, and they made castles of sand, and each child defended his castle and said, "This one is mine." They kept their castles separate and would not allow any mistakes about which was whose. When the castles were all finished, one child kicked over someone else's castle and completely destroyed it. The owner of the castle flew into a rage, pulled the other child's hair, struck him with his fist, and bawled out, "He has spoiled my castle. Come along, all of you, and help me to punish him as he deserves." The others all came to his help. They viciously beat the child. Then they went on playing in their sandcastles, each saying, "This is mine. No one else may have it. Keep away. Don't touch my castle." But evening came. It was getting dark, and they all thought they ought to be going home. And no one cared now about what became of the castle. One child stamped on his, another pushed his over with both hands. Then they turned away and went back, each to his home. Such a simple story, and such a great story. It says so much about human endeavor. You know, what's interesting to me is we start out with that sandy shore, the riverbank, and it's open, it's unobstructed, it's unstaked, right? No territory staked out yet. Doesn't belong to anyone. And then the kids make something of it. They make something of it. And once they make something of it, now they've got stuff that's theirs. And just think about our life and how we do that, right? Experience just shows up as this, unstaked. It's just experience. It doesn't belong to anybody. And then we make something of it. And once we've made something of it, then it becomes my experience. And once we've done that, well, now you can see just in that, the way that we put it together. This is my experience, is now there's ego there. We've made something of experience, then there's ego that shows up, or maybe there's ego that's showing up that makes something out of experience. It's hard to pin that one down. But once there's something there, that sandcastle, then I'm here for sure. And this is mine. Once I'm here, then what arises, and we know this from the teaching in the 12-fold chain of dependent arising, what arises is inclination toward this, away from that, toward your castle, and away from the other person's castle. Okay? And everybody make sure they each have their own. And then once inclination arises, where we want something or we don't want something, then we can see there's desire in there. Either we want something or we don't want something. And with desire, along with that comes grasping. This is my castle. And so one of the things I like about that story is it helps us to see how intimately objects and ego are, how they're really intertwined with one another. And I think the story does a nice job of illustrating the eighth precept, the eighth of the 10 grave precepts. And that is the precept of a follower of the way does not possess things selfishly. And there's that thing the thing, and then there's the selfishly, which is possessing things from a self. It raises an interesting question. Can we possess things unselfishly? The Bodhidharma tells us about this precept in his teachings. He says self-nature is clear and obvious. That's the nature of reality. It's clear and obvious. Self-nature is clear and obvious. That's what he means by self-nature, nature of reality. That's what our true self is. Think about that sandy riverbank, clear and obvious. There's just nothing impeding. Within the suchness of all pervading Dharma, he says, not clinging to a single form is called the precept of not being avaricious. So within the suchness, it's just the as it isness of all pervading Dharma. And Dharma here is capital D Dharma. This is reality. And it's all pervading, because how could what's showing up not be reality? How could it not be that? Within the suchness of all pervading Dharma, not clinging to a single form. Not clinging to a single form. And that is hard for us, right? We're like those kids on the beach at the castles. And as soon as the castles are there, then we cling to those. They're mine. That's yours. That's hers. Not clinging to a single form, though, Bodhidharma tells us, is called the precept of not being avaricious. And that's a kind of surprising turn when you think that the precept is to not possess things selfishly, right? It's like greed. Only a surprising turn, because greed has within it this, you can see desire in there. But desire for what? Well, it's desire to hang on to what you think is yours. It's the desire to have, I got this, right? And once you've got it, and that ego shows up, then all kinds of problems can arise, right? Then we've got, I got to protect my territory, and I have to keep you from encroaching in my territory, right? You think about that story, and I got rid of a few details that I just can't read that. But how quickly the children resort to cruelty. How quickly it turns into, that kind of violence. It's not just violence, but it goes overboard. Because it really seems like there's something at stake. Whatever it is. And it could be, how does this one get preempted? Well, it's just the one kid comes over and destroys somebody else's castle. When I was a number of years ago, my husband's nephews were toddlers, 3 years old, something like that. And I was sitting separately in this room, and they had Lego. And I was actually just watching one of them. There's twin boys. And one of the boys was building something with the Lego. And I was just watching him play. It was a lot of fun to watch, And then his brother came in. So he'd built like a big tower, basically, right? And it was kind of cool. And then his brother came in, and he got this look in his eye. And I went, oh, no, this is not going to go well. I didn't intercede. I just said, well, us brothers are going to have to learn this. And sure enough, the brother just came in, just kicked the tower down, just gave it a big old kick, And then the other brother started crying, and pandemonium broke out. There's something about that, and who knows what made this kid kick over somebody's sandcastle, could be it was encroaching a little bit on his territory. Could be that he's thinking, well, my sandcastle is better than yours, or probably even more likely, your sandcastle is better than mine. So I want to take it out of commission. But what we can notice then is it's all about me and what I like, what I feel threatened by, whatever it is, and then we're out there. And it all is centered around these sandcastles, these things that we've created that then we imbue with some kind of, I don't know, meaning, some kind of importance these sandcastles have. And we're all capable of this with just about anything. We make something of it. We encounter something and then it's ours. And then you better not mess around with it, right? When I was first taking a practice here at Dharma Field and I was learning about Buddhism, and Steve was saying, don't hold this too tightly. And you've probably heard him. I don't know if you've used this phrase in a while, but he'll sometimes talk about, he thinks of himself as being Buddhish rather than Buddhist, because when you get to a Buddhist, then you've got that hard kind of like, I'm a Buddhist, this is who I am. You're attaching and identifying with it, right? And I thought, well, I don't attach to Buddhism at all. I understand what my teacher's saying. And that was part of what I believed was going on until somebody started questioning what it was that I was doing. And then, the fire would just get going and I would go, wow, that's interesting. Or somebody would tell me what a Buddhist did and what a Buddhist didn't do, right? And then I would be like, oh, because there was a way that I understood what a Buddhist did and what a Buddhist didn't do. And if somebody's going to tell me any different, and I hadn't realized it until the actual fire started arising in me as I was starting to get angry or frustrated with the conversation that was going on, that I was possessing Buddhism. I was a Buddhist. Not only that, but I was a very particular kind of Buddhist. You could just keep refining that to Dharma field Buddhist, I guess. Right? And that's the way you do it. Get angry. And what was useful and what is useful about us getting angry. So we don't want to go thinking we go through our life and not get angry. You're going to get angry, right? But what was interesting to me is I did notice then what I was doing. Thing about anger, another precept that we have about harboring ill will, it's actually the 9th precept, says not measuring the self is a precept of not harboring ill will, not measuring the self. That's anger. So what I was able to do was see that there was like a line that I had that's it. If it crosses that, then that's outside of me and that's something I can get angry with, right? So it can be an opportunity for us to pay attention. And the usefulness of that is we can start seeing how we're clinging to these ideas we have. And when we're clinging to these ideas we have, it's because we're buying into their, like I said, their significance, their importance, their bigness, their thingness. It's very real to us. And when we have that realness, things kind of take on, I don't know, like they just take over. They have a kind of, I don't know how to put it, but they're really there. Think about these sandcastles again. The kids must know they're only sandcastles, right? They made them themselves. They're playing sandcastles. And yet, you've probably seen that. Kids can really get into their play, you know? So on one hand, they know it's just play, but on the other hand, something about it is very real. These sandcastles are it, man. That's what reality is. So I was playing once with a nephew of a friend of mine. This is a long time ago. And I don't know, the kid was, again, he was a toddler. Um, his name is Bjorn. I remember that because I was playing bear with him. It's going to be a bear. I don't know why I did that. And at some point, he got terrified. He was terrified. And I thought I was just playing and having a good time. And it just became very real. Just like these sandcastles do. So the kids know that these things are illusions, and yet they get caught up in them. They get caught up in the realness of this. And this is what we do. We get caught up in the realness of this that's showing up. Stuff shows up. Okay, stuff shows up. Comes and goes, comes and goes, comes and goes. But we get caught up in what we think is the realness of it. And part of that is thinking that these things are here, that they're actually here. And you extrapolate that. They're here for as long as you're here, right? And you don't really think about those kids with the sandcastles again. The sandcastles are real until it's time to go home. And then the sandcastles don't matter. But while they're occupied with them, they become very real. And the kids forget these are just sandcastles and they're gonna go away. It's not gonna be there probably tomorrow. I don't know if you've ever done that where you maybe were working. I had one friend who eventually became an architect. And we were in like junior high or something like that, maybe high school. And we were building this really elaborate sandcastle. He had like this vision. And then the next day, I just thought, well, I'm going to see if that sandcastle's still around. So I went to look, and of course, it was already like the ruins of an ancient castle. You could still see it was there because it was a pretty big thing that this guy was doing. He spent hours working on this sandcastle. So, we might understand that these things are going to go away, but while we're engaging with it, it's as if they're there, as if there's something there and they're going to be there. And if it goes away, I don't know, then we start beating whoever we think is responsible for, taking this thing away from us. It's as if what we do in our lives is we forget that we know, and we know this, that everything that is ceases to be. And as George Harrison put it, all things must pass. All things must pass. We know that. It's there in our minds. And yet we get caught up in our stuff and we kind of lose track of it. We don't pay attention. There's not awareness of that. I know I've talked about this before, but think about when you learned that everything dies, right? When you're a kid. And at that point, then you know that that's kind of the nature of our life. But then you forget about it. And then you don't really get that, and you get caught up in life. I want to share with you a story that I heard on the radio a number of years ago now, just because it's such a sweet story about that moment when we learn that everything's going to die. And actually, and I'm going to go into why I think this could be such a difficult lesson for us. And it has to do with that sense of things being here. So when we learn that those things aren't going to be here, that really gives it extra punch, right? And I think you can see that in this story. So this was an interview with Mariel Heller, and she's a filmmaker. And she's made a number of pretty interesting movies. She was being interviewed on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And you probably know her best. You probably don't know her, but you would know her work best by the film she happened to have been talking about on Fresh Air. So she directed the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which was kind of a biopic about Mr. Rogers. It was kind of a lovely, interesting little movie. And so she's telling Terry about how Mr. Rogers, an episode of Mr. Rogers that she was watching to research to make the movie, that she was watching with her young son, ended up being her having to teach her son about dying. And again, her son's response is just so sweet. It's so beautiful. So in the episode that Heller's watching with her son, Mr. Rogers is going to feed his fish. And he discovers that one of the fish is dead. And Mr. Rogers doesn't back away from stuff like that. He goes, oh, look at this, and then he decides to try to revive the fish. So he has a tank of, I don't know, salt water or something, and he puts the fish in the salt water and slashes the fish around. And then he tells the kids, oh, it looks like it's alive, but it's really not. It is dead. So then he goes to bury the fish. All right. So while he's burying the fish, he talks about his childhood dog, Mitzi, had died when he was a kid. And Heller says, while I was watching this episode, she goes, I watched her son, Wiley is the son's name. I just watched Wiley watch this episode, knowing that we hadn't spoken really very much about death. Wiley looks at me with this kind of skeptical look and goes, dogs don't die. Uh-oh. And I had this like Mr. Rogers in my head and went, well, no, dogs do die. And I told him, I guess what's a little bit of a stretch of the truth, but I said, when they're very old and their bodies are tired, dogs do die. So notice what she had to do already. There's this realization that her son is going to have that because of a lot of the baggage we bring with it is really painful and difficult, I mean, it just is, but it's more so with the baggage that we bring along with it. So she tries to soften it a little bit. You have to go, well, we all got a certain amount of time. And we know that that's not how life works, right? That dogs die at any moment. People die. All things die at any moment. That's just the nature of things. But then she continues. She says, and cats die. And she tells Terry Grush, she goes, and we have 2 cats. And Wiley looked at me and went, cats? Cats die? And I said, yeah. And he said, but we have great cats. There's just something so sweet about that. We have great cats. How could they possibly die? They're great cats. And I thought, oh God, what have I opened here? And then I pulled out a picture of one of our cats who had passed away when he was a baby. And I said, remember, I've told you about this cat who died, who's buried in the backyard. And I believe everyone believes different things, but I believe when I want to visit him, I can go to the cherry tree in the backyard and I can visit him. And I could kind of see wheels turning, wheels turning. And we kept watching the show for a few minutes. This is absolutely adorable. And then Wally turned to me and he goes, Mom, walruses don't die. And I said, well, walruses do die. And he started wailing in a way that I had never experienced before. It felt like he was weeping for all humanity or like the entire universe and just asked me if we could bury all the walruses in our backyard so we could visit them. And that's just so sweet. Do you know what I mean? Like at that moment, he's just feeling the pain and the suffering and all this. I mean, he's learning about death. And I remember learning about death, and you have this, it's like really hard to wrap your head around it. And his empathy, do you know what I mean? Like his compassion for those walruses is just so sweet. Or even his cats, And so Haller says, I held him and I was crying. And all I could figure out to say was, I know this hurts. I know this is painful. I don't know what to say, but this really hurts. Now, then they finish watching the episode of Mr. Rogers, and then she puts him to bed. So as I was putting him to bed, the dreaded question came. What do you think that question is? Which was, well, what about people? People don't get, the way he said it, people don't get dead, do they? And then we had our second round of weeping. And that was that, And we have those moments where we learn about death. I don't remember for me a specific moment, but I remember learning about it. And I remember being incredulous. It did not make sense. And Heller's son couldn't make sense. He was incredulous because what his mom was telling him didn't make sense. Right? These things are always here. The cats they're great cats. How could they die? Walruses, I imagine he only sees them like on TV programs or at the zoo or something like that, So he only ever sees them when they're alive. How could they possibly go? And this is a great question. Because what's really making this sting is a sense that they're here. They exist, right? They're lasting. And now they're not, right? Where do they go? Where did they come from? Where are they going, right? And so what makes this really difficult for Wiley, I think, and really what's touching about it is this is not the way that he understands the world. These sandcastles, while they're here, they seem very real to us, right? They seem permanent. They're just here for it to go. Whew. And yet they do go, right? So the world isn't permanent. Nothing is here, really, the way we think it is. It shows up, seems like it's here for a while. And yet, saying that, still, our cats die, you know, loved ones pass away. There's a really lovely haiku that I remember Norm reciting a few times, written by Isa, one of the great haiku poets. And he wrote it on the death of his infant daughter. And I was reading about this, and Isa had actually experienced quite a lot of death of loved ones in the course of his life, including at least one son who'd passed away in childhood. But when his infant daughter died, he wrote this haiku. He said, "This world of dew is a world of dew, and yet, and yet, it's, we feel it. This world is showing up, even though it is a world of impermanence, right? Even though we know all things must pass, we're still living this life. We still feel, and that's wonderful. And we don't want to not feel. But we get caught up on the and yet, when we forget the world of do, we lose sight of that. So that the things that show up, we treat them like the children treated those sandcastles. And then avarice shows up, attachment to these objects show up, right? We get greedy, we get angry. And with that stuff and their permanence, we think we're permanent, right? Again, we know that's not true, but our eyes are off the ball and we're looking at the sandcastles right now. We mourn for then the loss of what we think we have. And you think about that precept again, the precept of not being avaricious is not to possess things selfishly, because what we think we do, we think we have these things that we can hang on to. And so we mourn for that loss. And again, Heller's son, Wiley, when he realizes these things were going, he cries because he understands that's hard for everyone. It's hard for him. It'd be hard for the walrus, right? It's hard. It's difficult. He actually understands the suffering of this in that moment. The little boy understands the suffering. And do we? Can we hear what's going on? Can we hear the suffering that is arising in this world? And when we do, when we encounter it, what do we do in the face of that? And suffering shows up in all kinds of ways. It can show up as greed. It can show up as anger. Right? That's where it can show up. Do we hear the suffering in greed? Do we hear the suffering in hatred? Important to realize that we're all in this world of impermanence, right? And I say we're all in it. And that's not really the right way to put it, but this world is impermanent. And as long as we think there are these things here, and we're in this world of impermanence, that's the true nature of reality. It can be very unstabilizing. It can cause us to do a lot of things. So I just want to close out reminding us of great teaching from the Diamond Sutra. on the nature of phenomena. This is a little poem that ends the entirety of the Diamond Sutra, which is a remarkable sutra. And when you get done reading it, you might go, what is this about? It's got so much stuff going on in it. But at the end, we get this little poem. As stars at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream. Thus should you view what is conditioned. And when we can see that, then the world just, it's the same world, but it seems so different to us. When I think about those sandcastles, at the end of the story, as the children are pushing the sand back, castles down, stomping on them, they just return back to their original state, which is that openness, that boundlessness. I got through that talk without weeping. Every time I went over my notes yesterday, I was just sobbing. I thought, oh no, I don't know how to get through this. Does people have anything they want to say?
The two examples were interesting together, like the sandcastle and the walrus.
Yeah.
Because I hear the sandcastle story and I think, well, it's not about the sandcastle. I'm mad because of like the meanness of the person who kicked down my sandcastle.
Yeah.
But then I see it's just the same feeling thinking about someone you care about dying.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not about them then. I'm not sure. That just, I don't know if you have thoughts about
Yeah, that's a
that.
great insight. Absolutely great insight. The child knocking down that sandcastle, and then the woe is the sadness at having lost the sandcastle, right? And then lashing out. So suffering can show up as anger, especially when you're clinging to a sense of self. Because as I was talking about when I noticed that people would push against my ideas of Buddhism, right? That's when I realized what my limits were, right? Who I was and who I wasn't. And same thing with that kid, that had the sandcastle knocked down, and all the other kids, because they all agreed on whatever rules they were going to agree on. Yeah. But you're right. That and the sorrow for the walruses are the same. It's the same suffering that we have for all beings. But with Wiley, it was to cry. And with the other kid, it was to lash out. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So your talk reminded me of something that my son said when he was very little. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but I said, that was before you were born. And he got really angry. Could not imagine never being born. So the ego and, the denial of before you were born as well as death is very strong in human beings, I think.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah. That was part of when I was taught about dying, was a part of it was trying to think, where did I come from? And so I was trying to figure that out. But before you have an idea that you weren't always here. Yeah. And that anger, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and then so we might have a kid having a tantrum. And how do you put up with that? Like I recently have had, on a slightly different level, that I have a very active cat. I mean, he's very outgoing. In fact, again, I just brought him in. He's had some problems with an eye. There was an eye infection. So I was bringing him to the vet a couple times, and second time they brought him in, he was just sort of drooped over the examination table, just kind of hanging his head down. And I wanted to lick this. She goes, he's behaving like a dog, which is kind of what he's like a dog like cat. But anyhow, he I don't know why I started going off on this tangent now. It was something that he was doing where I just, oh, yeah, it's his response to the treatments, you know. So we have to put drops in his eyes and then put a cone around his head so he's not pawing at the eye. And so he wrapped me up in his, he's not a vicious cat at all. So he's been really sweet about all this. But this is the way it showed up, like, leave me alone. He wrapped his arms around me. He's got claws, but he didn't dig them in. Instead, he just put the back claws, if you know this, and he started, "Pop, pop, 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 pop," you know, and he was trying to bite me. And and I thought, well, I know what's going on here. So rather than, no, no, you know, whatever, the quick response, I just picked him up, set him away from me, and pet him and gave him, you know, loving words, knowing that that was suffering that was showing up for him. And that's the hard part for us is if it's your son, it's one thing, but if it's a stranger lashing out, you know what I mean? Or and we don't even know the context, it becomes very hard for us to see the suffering in that. And these kinds of stories can help us to see really what's at the heart of behavior that we might think of as really unacceptable. And it might be unacceptable behavior. So it's not to condone anything, but it's really to try to see where it's coming from and to act appropriately rather than to do what my husband does with our cat. Because our cat also needs to always be on our dining room table while we're eating. He doesn't like people food, but he has to be on our table while we're eating. So I just pick him up and I set him on the floor and I pet him and he jumps up again and well, when I put him on the floor, I pet him. And after 2 or 3 times, he's like, all right. And then he just leaves the room. My husband, when he gets over, Jasper, no, you know, and he's like yelling at the cat and the cat just kind of, he doesn't care. He knows he's not supposed to be up there. So yeah, if we can really see what's going on, then perhaps we can step into appropriate action, you know, whatever that might look like. So. Anything else? All right, thank you.